The crowded café buzzed with chatter when a young woman in her 20s, a self-proclaimed social justice advocate, overheard an older man shakily recounting his time in the military. She scoffed loudly, dismissing his pain as toxic masculinity and a relic of a war-loving generation. Heads turned, but the veteran simply nodded, a tear trailing down his weathered face. Then, with a calm but broken voice, he shared a story that would leave everyone in the room stunned, and her unable to hold back her tears. The café buzzed with its usual morning symphony, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of ceramic mugs, and the steady hum of conversations. Sunlight poured through the large windows, casting warmth across the cozy space. In one corner, Emily sat with her friends, her confident voice rising above the chatter. At just 22, she carried herself like someone who believed she had the answers to the world's problems. "It's honestly ridiculous," Emily said, leaning forward with a smirk. "These old guys and their PTSD, get over yourselves. War isn't some grand sacrifice, it's just violence. If they're traumatized, maybe they shouldn't have gone in the first place." Her friends laughed nervously, their unease growing as her voice carried through the café. One of them shot a glance toward a nearby table, but Emily dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "What?" she said, her tone mocking. "It's not like I'm lying." At a table just a few feet away, James sat quietly, cradling a mug of black coffee. His hands were weathered, trembling slightly as he lifted the cup to his lips. He was in his 60s, his face etched with lines that told of sleepless nights and battles fought long ago. Across from him, Paul, a fellow veteran, sat watching him carefully. "How have you been holding up, James?" Paul asked softly, his tone gentle and familiar. James nodded slowly. "Some days are better than others," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But the nights—" He trailed off, the weight of his unspoken words hanging between them. Paul sighed, understanding. The silence that followed was one only shared by those who had seen too much. It was a silence filled with memories of brothers lost and moments that could never be forgotten. Emily's voice shattered the quiet. "And don't even get me started on this whole hero complex," she said, leaning back in her chair. "War is just a business. People go, they fight, and then they expect us to feel sorry for them when they come back broken. Spare me." Paul tensed, his fists clenching under the table. James, however, didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on his coffee, the calm in his demeanor masking the storm beneath. "James, do you want me to—" Paul began, but James shook his head. "It's fine," James said softly. "She doesn't understand." Emily caught the exchange and smirked. Her gaze flicked to James, and she tilted her head as though sizing him up. "Oh, did I offend you?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Sorry, but maybe the truth just hurts." The room grew quieter. Conversations faltered, and heads turned toward her table. Even the barista paused mid-pour, her eyes darting toward the unfolding tension. James finally looked up, meeting Emily's gaze. His eyes, dark and tired, held a depth that made her falter for just a moment. "You're right," James said at last, his voice steady but heavy. "The truth does hurt, but it's not the truth you think." Emily raised an eyebrow, her smirk growing. "Oh, here we go," she said, rolling her eyes. "Let me guess. This is where you tell me about honor and sacrifice. Spare me. No one forced you to sign up." James nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "You're right about that, too," he said. "No one forced us, but someone had to." Emily scoffed, leaning back in her chair. "And that's supposed to make me feel bad? If you sign up for something, you don't get to complain about the consequences. That's on you." Paul opened his mouth to speak, but James placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Instead, James turned back to Emily, his gaze steady but sad. "Do you know what it's like," he began, his voice low but unshakable, "to hold your best friend as he dies in your arms? To hear his last words, knowing there's nothing you can do? Do you know what it's like to wake up every night hearing their voices, even though they're gone? Emily blinked, her bravado cracking, but she recovered quickly, crossing her arms. "Sounds like a personal problem," she said flippantly. The café fell silent. Even the faint hum of the espresso machine seemed muted. James took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with a deliberateness that silenced the room further. "You laugh at people like me," he said finally, his voice calm but cutting. "And maybe you think that makes you strong. But strength isn't about mocking what you don't understand. It's about carrying the weight of things you didn't choose because someone had to." His words lingered, sharp and undeniable. Emily shifted in her seat, her smirk fading. Around them, the other patrons sat frozen, their eyes locked on James. "For years," James continued, "I've carried memories I wouldn't wish on anyone. Not for glory, not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. And if you think that makes me weak, then I hope you never have to find out what real strength costs." Emily had no response. The café remained silent, the weight of James's words pressing down on everyone. Finally, James turned back to his coffee, his hand steady now. The conversation was over, but the impact of his words lingered, heavy in the air. The café resumed its gentle hum of clinking cups and murmuring voices, but the atmosphere was undeniably altered. Emily sat rigid, her face pale, her earlier bravado stripped away. Across the room, patrons exchanged glances, whispering quietly about the exchange they'd just witnessed. James sat still, his weathered hands gripping his coffee mug as if anchoring himself. Paul leaned in closer, his voice low. "You didn't have to say all that, James. She wouldn't have understood." James sighed, shaking his head. "I didn't say it for her," he murmured. "I said it because some truths need to be spoken, whether people are ready to hear them or not." Emily sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances. Chris, the one who usually took charge in awkward situations, cleared his throat. "Emily, maybe we should go." "I'm fine," Emily snapped, though her voice wavered. She stared at her untouched iced latte, condensation forming a small pool beneath it. After a long pause, she spoke quietly, almost to herself. "I just don't get it. Why would anyone willingly put themselves through something like that?" Paul overheard and glanced at James, his brow furrowing. "You want to explain it to her?" he asked. James took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling slowly. He didn't look at Emily, but when he began to speak, his voice was clearly meant for her. "We don't sign up because we want to suffer," he said softly. "We do it because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. At least, that's how it starts." Emily glanced at him, her curiosity overcoming her discomfort. She hated how his words made her feel, small and ignorant, like she was missing something crucial. "For me, it was family," James continued, his gaze distant. "My dad served in Vietnam, and my grandfather fought in World War II. I grew up hearing their stories, not the glory, but the moments where they helped people, made a difference. I wanted to be like them. I wanted to matter." Paul nodded solemnly, his lips pressed into a thin line. Emily's friends remained quiet, their earlier chatter replaced by an uneasy stillness. "But war doesn't care about your reasons," James said, his voice dropping. "It doesn't care about your plans or ideals. Once you're in it, everything changes." Emily hesitated before asking, "Then why didn't you leave? If it was that bad, why not just quit?" James turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Quit," he repeated, his tone carrying a quiet intensity. "You don't quit, because it's not just about you. It's about the person next to you. They're counting on you, just like you're counting on them. Out there, it's not about politics. It's about survival. It's about making sure your brothers come home." Emily looked down, heat rising in her cheeks. She had no response, her earlier confidence evaporating under the weight of his words. James leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "You want to know what real fear is?" he asked. "It's not failing a test or losing a job. It's lying in the dirt, bullets flying over your head, wondering if you'll see another sunrise. It's hearing your best friend call for you and knowing you're not fast enough to reach him." Emily flinched at the vividness of his words, her hands tightening into fists on her lap. Her friends sat frozen, unable to meet James's eyes. James leaned back, exhaling slowly. "But the worst fear isn't out there," he continued. "It's what you feel when you come home." Paul nodded in agreement, his expression dark. Emily glanced up, her confusion evident. "What do you mean?" James's voice softened. "When you come home, nothing feels right anymore. The streets you grew up on seem smaller. The people you know feel like strangers. The things that used to matter, they don't, and no one understands. They look at you like you're broken because they can't see the things you've seen. They don't hear the sounds you can't unhear." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. She quickly looked down, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being logical, but nothing about this felt logical. It felt raw and deeply real. "You asked why we do it," James said, his voice softening even further. "Why we go through it. The truth is, sometimes I don't know anymore. But I do know this. Every innocent life we saved, every person we helped, it was worth it. Even if it means I'll never sleep the same again." The café fell silent, his words settling like dust in the air. Paul reached out and placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. "You did good, James," Paul said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." James nodded, though his expression remained somber. He took another sip of his coffee, his hand steady now. Across the table, Emily sat motionless, her mind a storm of thoughts she couldn't process. For the first time in her life, she felt something she couldn't articulate, something that felt an awful lot like shame. The tension in the café lingered long after the exchange. Emily's friends had quietly excused themselves, mumbling half-hearted goodbyes as they shuffled out the door. Chris gave her an awkward pat on the shoulder before leaving, and soon Emily found herself alone at the table, her untouched iced latte in front of her. The drink had watered down, but she couldn't bring herself to touch it. James and Paul were still at their table speaking in low tones. Emily couldn't help but glance their way. Every time she looked at James, she felt an inexplicable heaviness settle over her. She hated the feeling. It wasn't like her to dwell on things, especially on strangers. And yet his words replayed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than she expected. She pulled out her phone, trying to distract herself by scrolling through social media. Pictures of smiling faces and motivational quotes filled her screen, but she couldn't focus. An article title caught her eye. PTSD rates among veterans skyrocket. Her thumb hovered over the link for a moment before she swiped past it, the guilt in her chest tightening. Unable to sit still any longer, Emily found herself standing, drink in hand. She didn't know why her feet were moving toward James's table. She didn't have a plan or even know what she wanted to say. But before she could stop herself, she was standing beside them. "Can I sit here?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost timid. Paul raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. But James nodded. "If you want," he said. Emily sat down, clutching her drink like a lifeline. Her fingers tapped nervously against the side of the cup, and for a moment she couldn't meet James's eyes. Finally, she forced herself to speak. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "For what I said earlier. It was wrong." James tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You meant it when you said it," he replied evenly. "Otherwise, you wouldn't have said it." Emily winced, but she nodded. "I guess I just didn't understand," she admitted. "I still don't, not really. But I want to. Paul snorted softly, leaning back in his chair. You want to understand? He asked, his tone laced with disbelief. What do you think you're going to learn in 5 minutes that'll make up for years of ignorance? Paul, James said quietly, his tone a warning. Paul sighed but fell silent, turning his gaze to the window. James turned back to Emily. What do you want to know? He asked. She hesitated, unsure where to start. Why did you do it? She asked finally. Why did you stay, even when it was so hard? James leaned forward, setting his coffee mug down. It's not about patriotism or politics, he said. When you're out there, it's about the person beside you. You fight for them, and they fight for you. It's that simple. Emily frowned. But what if it's not worth it? She asked. What if the price is too high? James's expression darkened slightly. Sometimes it is, he admitted. But when you're in it, you don't think about the price. You think about doing the right thing. And sometimes the right thing hurts the most. Emily looked down, her thoughts swirling. She had always believed she understood the world, but James's words made her feel as if she'd been living in a bubble. Do you regret it? She asked softly. James was quiet for a long moment. I regret the people I couldn't save, he said finally. The friends I lost. But I don't regret trying. Emily swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. She thought about the way she'd dismissed veterans in the past, labeling them as relics or people clinging to outdated ideals. Sitting across from James, she felt ashamed of how small-minded she'd been. Is it always like this? She asked. When you come back, I mean. Do people always judge you? James smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. Some do, he said. Some try to understand, and some, like you, start out judging but end up asking questions. That's all we can hope for. Paul snorted softly again, shaking his head. Not everyone asks questions, though, he muttered. Some just keep walking, pretending we don't exist. Emily glanced at him, unsure how to respond. I want to do better, she said finally, her voice firm. I don't want to just assume I know everything. I want to learn. James studied her, his gaze steady. That's a good start, he said, but learning isn't enough. Understanding takes work. Emily nodded, a flicker of determination sparking in her chest. She didn't know where to begin, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. As she stood to leave, she hesitated, turning back to James. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. James nodded. You're welcome, he replied. Emily walked out of the café, her mind racing. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure. She would never look at the world the same way again. The late afternoon sun stretched shadows across the sidewalk as Emily walked home, her steps slow and deliberate. Her thoughts replayed James's words from the café over and over. She had entered that room so certain of herself, her world view firmly intact. But James had torn it apart, piece by piece, with quiet, unflinching honesty. Now she was left feeling raw, exposed, and unsteady. When she reached her apartment, Emily dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch. She stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of her emotions. Why did she feel so unsettled? She had always prided herself on being progressive, logical, and open-minded. But in that moment at the café, she had been none of those things. She had been cruel, dismissive, and ignorant, and James had faced it with more dignity than she deserved. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Chris. Hey, you good? The message read. Emily sighed, typing back quickly. Yeah, just tired. Talk later. She wasn't ready to unpack what had happened, not to Chris, not to anyone. Not yet. Instead, Emily opened her laptop and stared blankly at the search bar. After a long pause, her fingers began to move, typing. Veterans, PTSD stories. The search results filled her screen. Life after combat. The hidden struggles of PTSD, veterans and trauma, what civilians don't see. She hesitated before clicking on a video interview. The thumbnail showed a man in his 40s, his face weary but kind. She clicked play. The man spoke about his time in Afghanistan, how the camaraderie in his unit had kept him going. But his tone shifted when he described returning home. He talked about the fireworks on the 4th of July that made him feel like he was back on the battlefield, the sound of a car backfiring that sent him diving for cover. His voice broke when he mentioned the friends he had lost, how their faces haunted him at night. Emily paused the video, her chest tight. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen as though it might provide answers. She had never thought about what veterans went through, not beyond the headlines and statistics she skimmed over. To her, war had always been abstract, something distant and unrelated to her life. But now, it felt real. James had made it real. Unable to sit still, Emily grabbed her jacket and headed out. The cool evening air brushed against her cheeks as she wandered the streets without a destination. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet seemed to carry her with purpose. Eventually, she found herself standing in front of a building she had passed countless times but never really noticed, a Veterans Resource Center. The sign on the door read, "Open to all." Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find or accomplish by going inside, but she felt compelled to do something. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The interior was modest but welcoming. A small desk stood near the entrance with pamphlets and flyers neatly arranged on top. A few people sat in a lounge area, speaking quietly. A woman with kind eyes and a warm smile approached Emily. "Hi there," the woman said. "Can I help you with something?" Emily shifted uncomfortably, her hands stuffed into her jacket pockets. I'm not a veteran," she stammered. I wanted to learn more." The woman nodded, her smile widening. "That's wonderful," she said. "We have a lot of resources for people who want to understand. Is there something specific you're interested in?" Emily hesitated before answering. "PTSD. I think I said some things earlier today to a veteran that weren't fair. I want to understand." The woman's expression softened. "You're not the first person to come here feeling that way," she said gently. "Come on, I'll show you where we keep our materials." She led Emily to a bookshelf lined with books, brochures, and DVDs. Picking up a small booklet, she handed it to Emily. The cover read, "Understanding PTSD, a guide for civilians." "This is a good place to start," the woman said. "PTSD isn't just about what happens during war. It's about how the brain processes trauma. For veterans, it's often tied to combat, but it can also come from losing people they care about or struggling to adjust back to civilian life." Emily nodded, clutching the booklet tightly. "Thank you," she said. The woman smiled warmly. "If you have questions, don't hesitate to come back, and thank you for wanting to learn. It means a lot." As Emily left the center, she felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She opened the booklet as she walked, reading the words as they painted a vivid picture of the challenges veterans faced. Hypervigilance, flashbacks, sleeplessness. The more she read, the more she understood how much James, and so many others like him, carried with them every day. When she got home, Emily sat down at her desk with a notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote, "What I've learned." Beneath it, she began jotting down notes from the booklet. How PTSD affects memory, how it rewires the brain, how it makes even ordinary experiences feel dangerous. By the time she finished, the page was nearly full. Emily stared at her notes, her mind returning to James. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she made herself a promise. The next time she met someone like him, she wouldn't judge. She would listen. Emily's resolve to understand more grew stronger with each passing day. The booklet from the Veterans Center became her constant companion, and every evening after work, she would read it carefully, underlining sentences and scribbling notes in the margins. The more she learned, the more she realized how much she had taken for granted. One evening, while flipping through the booklet, Emily came across a section titled, "The Transition to Civilian Life." The words hit her harder than she expected. It described how many veterans struggled to find their place in a world that no longer made sense to them. Things as simple as grocery shopping or attending a family gathering could become overwhelming. The section went on to explain how veterans often felt isolated, like they were speaking a language no one else understood. Emily closed the booklet and stared at the wall. Her chest felt heavy. She thought back to James in the café, the way his hand trembled slightly as he held his coffee. How many moments like that had he endured? How many days had he spent feeling invisible in a world that had moved on without him? Determined to do more than just read, Emily decided to visit the Veterans Resource Center again. This time, she didn't hesitate at the door. She walked in with purpose, clutching the booklet tightly in her hands. The same kind woman from her first visit greeted her with a smile. "Back again?" the woman asked. Emily nodded. "I want to help," she said simply. The woman's smile widened. "That's wonderful to hear. We're always looking for volunteers." Emily spent the next hour learning about the programs the center offered. They organized everything from resume workshops to therapy sessions to support groups for veterans and their families. One program in particular caught Emily's attention. A storytelling group where veterans could share their experiences in a safe, supportive environment. "Do you think I'd be allowed to sit in on one of the sessions?" Emily asked. The woman tilted her head, considering the question. "Normally, we keep it to veterans and their families," she said, "but I can ask the group if they'd be comfortable having you there as an observer." Emily nodded. "Thank you," she said. "I'd really appreciate that." A week later, Emily found herself sitting in a circle of chairs in a small room at the resource center. Around her were half a dozen veterans, their ages ranging from late 20s to early 70s. Some wore baseball caps with military insignias, others wore simple, nondescript clothes. James was among them. Emily's heart raced when she saw him, but she quickly looked away, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She wasn't sure if he recognized her, but if he did, he didn't show it. The session began with introductions. Each veteran said their name and a little about their background. When it was James's turn, he spoke quietly but confidently. "I'm James," he said. "Served in Iraq. Been out for about 15 years now. Still trying to figure things out." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled over the room. Emily felt her chest tighten. As the session went on, the veterans shared their stories. One man talked about how hard it was to adjust to the silence of civilian life after years of constant noise and chaos. A woman in her 30s described how she struggled to connect with her children, who couldn't understand why their mom sometimes needed to lock herself in a room just to breathe. When it was James's turn to speak again, he hesitated for a moment before looking down at his hands. "There's this one memory," he began, his voice low. "It's not even the worst thing that happened, but it's the one that sticks with me the most." The room was silent as James spoke. He described a day in Iraq when his unit had been ambushed. He had been in the middle of the chaos, trying to get to one of his friends who had been hit. But before he could reach him, the fighting intensified, and James had been forced to take cover. By the time it was over, his friend was gone. "I keep thinking about how I wasn't fast enough," James said, his voice trembling. "I know it wasn't my fault. I know that. But it doesn't change how it feels." Emily's throat tightened as she listened. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but she knew it wasn't her place. All she could do was sit quietly and let his words sink in. After the session ended, most of the veterans stayed to chat and grab coffee from a small table in the corner. Emily lingered near the door, unsure if she should leave or stay. She was about to slip out when James approached her. "You're the girl from the café," he said, his tone neutral. Emily's face flushed. "I am," she admitted. Thank you for letting me be here. I wanted to understand, to learn." James studied her for a moment before nodding. "It's good that you came," he said simply. Emily hesitated, then said, "Your story. It really affected me. I'm so sorry for what I said before. I didn't understand, but I'm trying to." James's expression softened. "That's all anyone can do," he said. "Try." For the first time, Emily felt like she was on the right path. It wouldn't erase what she had said, but it was a start. The days following her second meeting with James at the Veterans Center were transformative for Emily. She threw herself into volunteering, dedicating her weekends and evenings to helping out at the center. She filed papers, set up chairs for support groups, and handed out coffee during sessions. At first, her interactions with the veterans were minimal. She didn't want to intrude. But as time passed, they began to open up to her, and she learned more than she ever could from a book. One Saturday morning, Emily arrived early for her shift. The center was quiet, the usual buzz of activity still an hour away. She was setting up a table in the lounge when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Early, as always," James said, his tone light. Emily turned and smiled. "I like to get a head start," she said. "You're here early, too." James shrugged, holding up a folder. "Paperwork for one of the programs. Thought I'd get it out of the way before the session starts." They fell into an easy conversation, something that would have been unimaginable weeks ago. Emily still felt a pang of guilt whenever she thought back to their first encounter in the café, but James had never brought it up again. Instead, he treated her with a quiet respect that only deepened her admiration for him. As they talked, James mentioned a fundraiser the center was planning, a community event to raise money for mental health resources. Emily's eyes lit up. "Can I help?" she asked eagerly. James raised an eyebrow. "You've been helping non-stop since you got here." "I mean, with the event," Emily clarified. "I could organize something. A raffle, maybe? Or a silent auction?" James chuckled softly. "If you're up for it, I'm sure the staff would appreciate the help." Over the next few weeks, Emily poured her energy into planning the fundraiser. She reached out to local businesses for donations, created flyers, and worked late into the night to coordinate every detail. The veterans at the center noticed her efforts, and their initial skepticism gave way to appreciation. Even Paul, who had been cold toward her at first, started greeting her with a nod and a half smile. On the day of the event, the center was bustling with activity. Tables lined the room, covered with donated items for the auction. A stage had been set up for speeches and performances, and the aroma of freshly grilled food wafted through the air. Emily moved through the crowd, checking on vendors and greeting attendees. Her nerves were on edge. She wanted everything to be perfect. James found her near the auction table, clipboard in hand. "Looks like you pulled it off," he said, nodding at the crowd. Emily exhaled a laugh. "Not yet. The night's still young." As the evening progressed, veterans took to the stage to share their stories. Some spoke about their struggles, others about the joy they found in the friendships they had made at the center. James was one of the speakers, and Emily watched from the back of the room as he stepped up to the microphone. "I don't talk about this often," James began, his voice steady. "But when I came back from Iraq, I felt like I'd left a part of myself behind. I thought I'd never feel whole again. This center, it gave me a place to heal, a place to connect. And seeing so many people here tonight supporting us, it reminds me that we're not alone." The room erupted into applause, but Emily's hands stayed clasped together. James's words resonated deeply, a reminder of why she had thrown herself into this work. At the end of the night, as the crowd thinned and the staff began cleaning up, James approached Emily. He held out a small box wrapped in plain paper. "What's this?" Emily asked, surprised. Just a thank you, James said, for everything you've done. You didn't have to, but you did. Emily unwrapped the box to find a simple keychain, a small metal tag engraved with the words, "Service is strength." Her throat tightened and she looked up at James. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James replied. "Just keep doing what you're doing." The keychain felt heavy in her pocket as Emily walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights. She paused at the corner where the Veteran Center's sign was still faintly visible. For a moment, she stood still, breathing in the cool night air. Everything felt different now. Her perspective, her priorities, even the way she viewed her own small role in the world. She thought about James's words earlier that night. Service is strength. They weren't just words etched into metal. They were a promise. One she intended to keep. Emily walked on, the sound of her footsteps steady, her resolve stronger than ever.